Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I'm going to be taking you on a little tour of New York in a little bit of a different way. We're going to look at some of the unknown parts of New York City, what we might call the 7 unknown wonders of New York. Behind me is a structure that's most unique. It's known as Grant's Tomb. It was dedicated in 1897, although Grant died in 1885, flat broke. And he wrote his memoirs as he was dying. And the money raised from those memoirs saved his family from disaster. But also, there was a great deal of respect for President Grant. Of course, he had been the general during the American Civil War. And so he was buried in a temporary mausoleum that was actually behind where this structure now stands. And then in 1897, his remains were brought here, and it was dedicated by President William McKinley. There was an amazing big party and celebration as this was done. And today, it's one of the more unique parts of New York City, and in many respects, one of the more unknown parts of New York City. This structure was in extremely bad condition about 10 years ago, and now has been totally restored. It's an amazing structure and the largest mausoleum in the United States. I'm standing in what was once known as the Weeping Room here at Grand Central Station. This is where the soldiers would leave on their troop trains during World War I and World War II. This is where their families would take leave of their soldiers. This is where many went to Europe to fight in World War I or World War II. Many would never return. This was their last touch with New York. It's a special place. It has a wonderful history with New York. And sadly, it's one of the most forgotten places in the history of New York. This room called the Weeping Room. Track 42, as you see behind me, is where every troop train would leave. The building behind me is the Hotel Knickerbocker. Of course, it's not known by that name right now, but it soon will be again. It was built in 1904 by John Jacob Astor of Titanic fame. John Jacob Astor was a very, very famous millionaire who also was involved in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, which was long since destroyed. But this structure still exists. And the important thing about it is, this was one of the great social areas of New York City. The great operatic tenor Enrico Caruso lived right here at the Knickerbocker, lived here for many years. And there's an interesting incident that took place here in 1918. On November 11th, Armistice Day, Helen Hayes, the famous actress, of which there is a theater named for her on 42nd Street, ran to Broadway and 42nd. She said, out from the corner of the Knickerbocker, out came Enrico Caruso, and he sang the national airs of the Allies. It was a wonderful and exciting moment for many people in New York. Hi, I'm on Pier 54 here off of the Hudson River, and this is a very, very important pier in history here in New York. Because on this pier, on April the 18th, 1912, the survivors of the RMS Titanic were brought here by the rescue ship, which was a canard ship, the RMS Carpathia. Now, another thing took place here that's very important as well. In the beginning of May of 1915, the Lusitania left from this side of the pier in her final voyage, and she would be torpedoed a few days later off the Irish coast. The other thing that's very interesting about this pier is it's often been stated that the Titanic was supposed to tie up at this pier. No. The Titanic was to sail to Pier 59. That was the White Star Pier. But when the Carpathia came here on April the 18th, 1912, a very dramatic incident occurred. The Carpathia tied up, and then all of the Titanic's lifeboats were pulled over to Pier 59. I'm I'm standing in front of the New York Public Library, which is a very, very important structure. But what is more important is the fact that this library is built onto the foundations of the New York City Reservoir, which once stood here. In fact, the reservoir, which was once called the New York City Aqueduct, was built in 1843 and was here for many years until the end of the 19th century. In the beginning of the 20th century, they tore down the aqueduct and built the library structure here on top of the foundations of that aqueduct, which is very, very important and very fascinating. It's a little bit of New York history that is not known. Of course, one of the most important things about the New York Public Library is the fact of these lions that are behind me. They're very well known. The library was built and finished in 1911. It was built with a lot of money, and one of the subscribers to building this library was John Jacob Astor, who sadly was lost in the Titanic disaster of 1912. Hi, we're in Washington Square Park, and this is a pretty important place historically as well. It wasn't always a park. This was once a square where soldiers drilled, also where the hanging gallows were, and where all the executions took place. In fact, a very unknown fact about this entire area here is that it was once Potter's Field. And what Potter's Field means is this is where they would bury the dead that they didn't have any place to put them. So this was a graveyard as well. People do not realize this as they go marching around here, and I bet a lot would feel very, very weird about the fact had they known that. Something else that's rather fascinating about this part is the arch behind me. It was designed by Stanford White. Now, the original arch that was here was made of wood, and it was put up in 1889. The present one was built in the beginning of the 20th century. The statues in front were not put in until 1918. Now, Stanford White's a rather fascinating character. You see, he was a famous architect, and he had a young girlfriend named Evelyn Nesbit. And Evelyn Nesbit's husband was Harry K. Thaw. And he was quite jealous of Stanford White. And so White, who designed Madison Square Garden, was at a presentation at Madison Square Garden. And Harry K. Thaw came by and shot him. And so Stanford White never really got to see this arch in its present form. Hi, I'm in Times Square, and Times Square is the center of everything here in New York. It's the center of entertainment, showbiz, and whatever else you can think of. But the structure behind me is really the amazing structure here in Times Square. It's where the Times building once stood, actually, even though it sort of stands still. It's empty. No one lives there, no one works there, no one does anything there anymore. In fact, it is perhaps the greatest piece of advertising space in the whole country, and the most expensive. So you're looking at perhaps one of the most expensive pieces of real estate in all of New York. Now, years ago, Times Square was a lot simpler. In fact, well, it was owned a lot by Al Jolson. Al Jolson was a famous performer on Broadway. And before that time, Broadway was owned by George M. Cohan. And when you come here and look at the Times building in Times Square, you will see a statue of George M. Cohan in this area. So come on down, take a look. It's kind of fun. And when you do look at some of the unusual things. And of course, this structure here is truly one of them.